2 million profiles vanished into the hands of a nation at dawn. 17 buildings across Ouagadougou fell silent in a single morning, their glass windows hiding a secret empire of wires, servers, and stolen voices. For 15 years, Africa's lifeblood, its data, its resources, its private conversations, had been siphoned away under the banners of aid and development. What many believed were gifts of progress were in fact chains of dependence, invisible but binding. Yet one figure stood at the crossroads of night and morning. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not send troops to capture land or topple monuments. He sent them to reclaim the unseen frontier, the codes, the cables, the maps of tomorrow. The question that now echoes far beyond Burkina Faso is simple but seismic. If sovereignty no longer lives on maps, but in fiber cables and encrypted files, who truly governs Africa? Do not look away. What comes next may change how Africa writes its future. Subscribe and stay with us. This is not only a story of raids and revelations, it is the first spark of a continental awakening, a moment that could turn silence into resistance, dependence into dignity, and exploitation into independence. It began before the sun rose. At precisely 5 o'clock in the morning, Captain Ibrahim Traoré signed an order that would send ripples far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. By 7 o'clock, security forces fanned out across the capital. 17 separate facilities, offices that appeared to house aid projects, technology incubators, and educational initiatives, were struck simultaneously. In less than 2 hours, the silence of dawn was broken by the roar of armored vehicles, the whir of helicopters, and the sharp commands of soldiers executing a mission with surgical precision. On the surface, these places bore the colors of progress. One office displayed banners of digital agriculture, promising to modernize farming. Another operated under the title of Educational Partnership, claiming to enhance local schools. A warehouse only 2 streets from the Ministry of Education carried the appearance of a low-key storage facility. Yet when doors were forced open and equipment dismantled, the reality emerged. Racks of servers blinked with encrypted routers, satellite uplinks, and concealed transmission systems. Data storage units carried offshore IP addresses, with many traced to Herzliya, Israel. Inside one warehouse, investigators made a discovery that would shake the capital: files containing more than 2 million personal records of Burkina Faso's citizens. Names, addresses, biometric scans, call logs, and metadata stretching back nearly a decade were stacked like a harvest of stolen lives. This was not merely theft. It was the siphoning of a people's digital identity. To control such information is to hold leverage over elections, markets, even the intimate routines of everyday citizens. In the soil of this landlocked nation, it was no longer gold or cotton being extracted, but data, the seed of 21st century sovereignty. Other sites revealed maps of mineral reserves with a precision that only foreign intelligence agencies could have drawn. One file contained coordinates of gold and manganese deposits, later confirmed identical to documents circulating in Tel Aviv. Cabinets yielded intercepted cabinet discussions, conversations on defense, trade, and national budgets, stored in encrypted archives awaiting transfer abroad. Every seized cable, every confiscated hard drive, testified to a systematic pattern. This was not isolated activity, but a network carefully planted over years. By 8:45, all 17 targets were under government control. Civilian casualties were avoided, and officials described the operation as silent, exact, and decisive. Colonel Issoufou Zongo, spokesperson for the armed forces, declared in a press briefing, "What we discovered was not development assistance. It was systematic surveillance." His words resonated like a verdict delivered not just for Burkina Faso, but for all of Africa. For many in Ouagadougou, the sight of troops removing crates of servers and sealed evidence boxes marked the unveiling of a hidden empire. Videos shared online within hours showed soldiers carrying metallic cases, their faces set with grim determination. Social media spread these images across West Africa, transforming a domestic operation into a continental revelation. The narrative was simple, yet profound. A small nation had dared to defend its digital borders as fiercely as its land. Observers were quick to underline the scale. Never before had a West African country dismantled such a sprawling espionage infrastructure in one coordinated morning. Analysts at the University of Ouagadougou called it a precedent, a rupture in the silence that had long surrounded foreign dominance of African information systems. The raid was not a symbolic act. It was the reclaiming of soil, not the earth beneath one's feet, but the soil of data where the seeds of governance and economy take root. As the morning turned into afternoon, questions multiplied. Were these facilities acting alone, or were they nodes in a continental web? How deep did the roots of this hidden network run? And how many other African capitals concealed similar machinery behind banners of aid? What began as a local operation was already stirring debates of continental magnitude. The evidence was sealed. The streets were buzzing. The world, however, had yet to fully grasp the storm that had just been unleashed. The dawn raids had ended, but their echoes were only beginning to resound. And the next wave would not come from soldiers, but from the voices of citizens and leaders across Africa. The morning after the raids, the air in Ouagadougou was thick with anticipation. Crowds gathered around televisions and cafes, radios blared across marketplaces, and students huddled over smartphones. All eyes awaited the nation's leader. Then, as cameras switched on, Captain Ibrahim Traoré appeared at the presidential podium. His words were not spoken softly. They rang like a drumbeat across the continent. Africa is no longer your laboratory. We are not your test subjects. This continent will no longer be your blind spot. The statement struck deep. It was not merely a declaration of Burkina Faso's defiance, but a call to arms for an entire continent weary of invisible chains. For years, the narrative had been that Africa needed aid, that foreign expertise was the only path to progress. Now, with servers and hard drives displayed as evidence, the story had changed. What was revealed was not partnership but exploitation masquerading as generosity. Across the city, slogans began to appear on walls. Our data, our choice. Students painted murals of broken chains where fiber cables once bound. Mothers marched through the streets carrying placards. Digital sovereignty is national sovereignty. The anger was palpable, but so was the pride. People who had long felt voiceless saw their government seize the microphone and speak with conviction. Social media amplified the wave. Within hours, hashtags like Africa Not For Sale and Our Data, Our Choice trended across West Africa. Videos filmed during the raids circulated widely. Soldiers carrying crates of servers, helicopters hovering above government districts, and the sight of sealed compounds guarded by armed men. For many Africans, it was the first time they witnessed a state not only resist external intrusion, but expose it with clarity. Neighboring governments were quick to take notice. In Bamako, Malian authorities confirmed the shutdown of 3 companies suspected of funneling data abroad. In Niamey, officials reported that a surveillance facility hidden inside an embassy compound had been neutralized. Guinea's interim government announced the freezing of contracts linked to foreign suppliers. Togo suspended new telecom agreements pending a full audit. Each announcement rippled outward, signaling that Burkina Faso's defiance was contagious. Scholars described the moment as unprecedented. Dr. Amadou Sissoko, a political scientist based in Bamako, remarked, "For the first time in decades, heads of state are uniting not to request assistance, but to safeguard themselves against it." His observation captured the essence of the shift. Africa's leaders, long portrayed as petitioners, were beginning to speak as defenders of sovereignty. In the streets, the people echoed this sentiment. In Conakry, young activists carried banners declaring, "Africa is not for sale." In Bamako, university students sang chants of defiance, turning slogans into songs of resistance. In Ouagadougou itself, murals multiplied overnight, depicting fiber cables cut with machetes, satellites falling from the sky, and the words, "We choose our future." International media, however, remained divided. Western networks carried minimal coverage, often framing the events as destabilizing or authoritarian. Yet African outlets, joined by channels in Asia, broadcast the story as a turning point. Al Jazeera called it the unveiling of a hidden empire. China's Global Times described it as a turning point in Africa's technological independence. Russian outlets framed it as evidence of hypocrisy in the global order. For the citizens of Burkina Faso, these external interpretations mattered less than the feeling on the ground. Market vendors spoke openly about betrayal, about how their trust in so-called partners had been broken. Civil society organizations warned that legitimate aid projects might now be tainted with suspicion, yet even they acknowledged the necessity of defending the nation's dignity. By the end of that week, 6 heads of state, from Mali, Guinea, Niger, Togo, Ghana, and Benin, gathered in Ouagadougou. The summit was unannounced, closed to foreign media. At the center of the table lay folders filled with documents seized during the raids. Traore proposed what he called the Continental Digital Sovereignty Framework. 4 pillars defined it: transparency of all foreign telecom investments, mandatory local storage of citizen data, immediate expulsion of undeclared intelligence operations, and a collective defense pact treating an attack on one nation's data as an attack on all. The leaders debated late into the night. Some urged caution, others demanded enforcement, but by dawn, consensus emerged. A declaration was signed recognizing digital sovereignty, continental priority. Observers compared it to the Monroe Doctrine, but rewritten for Africa in the digital age. The people had marched. The leaders had spoken. The framework was born, yet the confrontation was far from over. The question looming now was not whether Africa would resist, but how the rest of the world would respond. The continent had risen in defiance, but beyond its borders, powerful voices were preparing their reply, and the next battle would be fought on the stage of global diplomacy. In the days that followed, Burkina Faso found itself standing at a crossroads between outrage and opportunity. On the streets of Ouagadougou, anger lingered, but it was accompanied by something rare: a sense of unity. Market vendors, students, civil servants, and soldiers spoke the same words: sovereignty. The raids had not only dismantled a network of espionage, they had also ignited a collective awareness that privacy, dignity, and independence were not abstract ideals, but daily necessities. Families who once viewed data as distant and technical now recognized its value. Conversations in markets shifted. Instead of debating food prices alone, citizens spoke of the right to control their digital identities. At universities, lectures extended beyond traditional subjects. Professors urged students to see data as the new frontier of freedom. The narrative of independence, once tied only to territory and armies, now stretched into cyberspace. Government officials moved swiftly. Within a week, provisional rules were announced. All citizen data must be hosted on servers physically located within national borders. Foreign companies operating in telecoms would undergo emergency audits, and any project failing to disclose full technical details would face suspension. These rules were not just paperwork, they were shields, hastily raised to protect a nation suddenly aware of its vulnerability. The political consequences were immediate. For decades, Burkina Faso had been portrayed internationally as small, landlocked, and dependent. Yet the operation transformed its image overnight. Leaders from Mali, Guinea, Niger, and Togo echoed Ouagadougou's stance, signaling a new regional bloc. Citizens across West Africa began referring to Traoré not simply as a national figure, but as a symbol of defiance for the entire continent. Inside Parliament, debates grew intense. Some lawmakers warned of economic retaliation from Western partners. Others insisted that the cost of dependence was greater than any sanction. The phrase digital sovereignty appeared in speeches, draft bills, and policy documents with a frequency unseen before. Within months, the seeds planted by Operation Clear Sight began sprouting into legislation, public campaigns, and new institutions. Economically, the shock was twofold. On one hand, Certain contracts with European and Israeli-linked firms were frozen, halting projects in telecoms and infrastructure. Critics feared job losses and slower development. On the other hand, fresh opportunities emerged. India proposed building regional data centers under African ownership. Russian experts offered cybersecurity training programs. Chinese firms pledged fiber optic projects with guarantees of local control. Indigenous startups, once sidelined, suddenly found space to grow. One Ghanaian cloud storage company announced plans to relocate its servers from Europe back to Africa, citing the new regulatory climate. For ordinary citizens, the effects soon became tangible. 6 months after the raids, internet speeds had doubled while costs dropped by nearly half. National agencies reported a 47% reduction in cybersecurity breaches compared with the year prior. These improvements did more than enhance daily life. They demonstrated that sovereignty could deliver material benefits. The link between independence and prosperity, long dismissed as romantic rhetoric, was now visible in real terms. Faster connections, cheaper services, and safer systems. Yet challenges loomed. Civil society groups raised concerns about the government's ability to maintain oversight, training local engineers, financing data centers, and monitoring compliance required resources that were scarce. Without vigilance, sovereignty could remain a slogan rather than a reality. But the determination was undeniable. Graffiti in Ouagadougou captured the mood. No cloud unless it is ours. The deeper political shift was harder to measure, but no less powerful. For the first time since independence, citizens spoke of a second liberation. Not from colonial armies, but from digital occupation. Commentators described this wave of activism as the rebirth of an anti-colonial Africa, redefined for the 21st century. Where once foreign powers sought land and minerals, now they sought data and algorithms. And just as past generations resisted with blood and sacrifice, the new generation pledged to resist with code, policy, and solidarity. This reframing carried implications beyond Burkina Faso. In Nigeria, Kenya, and Morocco, lawmakers announced reviews of foreign technology contracts. Debates at the African Union called for continent-wide safeguards. Public surveys revealed growing distrust of Western firms. Over 70% of respondents questioned their intentions, with young Africans showing the highest levels of skepticism. The question, however, lingered. Could this unity hold? History had shown that Africa's moments of solidarity often faltered under external pressure and internal divisions. Critics warned that sanctions, aid cuts, or diplomatic isolation could fracture the movement. Others countered that the momentum was too strong, that once citizens had tasted the idea of digital freedom, they would not willingly return to dependence. The streets of Ouagadougou, painted with slogans, told the story better than any speech. Sovereignty was no longer a word confined to textbooks. It was written on walls, spoken in markets, and debated in classrooms. The people had claimed ownership of their data, their dignity, and their destiny. The next challenge was ensuring that this awakening could withstand the storms yet to come. The citizens had risen, the laws were drafted, and the benefits were visible. But as Burkina Faso looked inward to secure its gains, the eyes of the world turned toward it, and the international confrontation was about to begin. The morning raids in Ouagadougou did not remain a domestic matter for long. Within 24 hours, phone lines from Paris to Washington lit up. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu personally called Captain Ibrahim Traoré, insisting that Israel's presence in Africa was purely developmental. His tone was firm, his warning sharper. Burkina Faso risked destabilizing not only itself, but the entire region. Traoré's reply was equally unambiguous. There is no misunderstanding when you spy on us. That is not development. That is occupation. The call ended without resolution, and the silence that followed spoke volumes. Western capitals quickly took their positions. In Paris, editorials portrayed Traoré as authoritarian. In London, headlines warned of destabilization. In Washington, think tanks branded him radical, a threat to regional stability. The European Union issued cautious statements, hinting at possible sanctions if Burkina Faso pursued policies deemed hostile to foreign investment. France suspended certain military training programs, citing erosion of trust. The language was measured, but the intent clear: to frame the operation not as liberation, but as provocation. Yet the reaction beyond the West was different. Russia, China, and India openly praised the raids as a step toward technological independence. Moscow offered cybersecurity training under African oversight. Beijing pledged to lay fiber optic backbones owned entirely by African states. New Delhi proposed to build data centers staffed with local engineers. For once, the continent was not positioned as a recipient of charity, but as a partner setting conditions. The African Union also moved swiftly. An emergency session in Addis Ababa drew delegates from across the continent. Nigeria's representative delivered words that electrified the chamber. If one nation is spied on, all of us are spied on. If one loses sovereignty, all of us lose. Applause erupted, echoing through the hall like a drumbeat of unity. Soon after, a resolution was drafted to explore continent-wide data protection laws and collective enforcement mechanisms. Public opinion, meanwhile, crystallized in the streets. Demonstrations flared across West Africa. Students in Bamako, mothers in Conakry, activists in Lomé, all carrying variations of the same slogan: digital sovereignty is national sovereignty. Online, hashtags demanding accountability trended higher than any Western narrative. Independent journalists investigated how years of hidden data extraction had influenced everything from mining contracts to fuel prices. The conversation was no longer technical. It was existential. For the first time, Africa was not merely reacting to global rules, but proposing its own. Commentators described it as the birth of a doctrine, a continental stance that declared data, like land and resources, was not for sale. In this reframing, the phrase African sovereignty took on a new dimension, no longer tied solely to borders on a map, but to the invisible streams of the digital age. Still, challenges loomed. Western governments cautioned against what they labeled isolationism. Think tanks predicted economic fallout. Yet African leaders insisted that without control of their data, there could be no true independence. The diplomatic fault lines had been drawn. On one side stood nations defending their right to own their digital soil. On the other, those who feared losing access to a continent long treated as an open field. The world had taken its positions. Allies and adversaries had revealed their cards. But the question remained: what road would Africa choose for its own future? The dust of Operation Clear Sight had barely settled, yet its impact was already reshaping the horizon. In Ouagadougou, new policies were no longer promises, but lived realities. Citizen data stored within national borders, foreign firms subject to audits, and contracts rewritten with clauses of transparency. The practical results: faster internet, reduced costs, fewer breaches, offered a glimpse of what sovereignty could deliver when defended with determination. But the path forward was not without obstacles. Building secure data centers required immense resources. Training engineers and cybersecurity specialists demanded years of investment. Political divisions within the continent threatened to dilute the momentum. Some leaders, wary of jeopardizing ties with Western donors, urged caution. Others pressed for rapid reforms, arguing that hesitation would only invite renewed exploitation. The choice before Africa resembled a fork in the road. One path led to dependence, cloaked in convenience, foreign corporations managing infrastructure, dictating terms, and exporting profit. The other led to autonomy, though steep and rugged. Investment in local talent, the slow cultivation of indigenous industries, and the discipline to enforce rules even against powerful outsiders. The question was not merely economic, it was moral. Would Africa trade short-term comfort for long-term dignity, or would it grasp the difficult road toward independence? For citizens, the debate was already settled. In markets, vendors spoke of sovereignty as they once spoke of land reform. At universities, students described digital freedom as the second independence. Grassroots groups launched campaigns under slogans like, "No cloud unless it is ours," and "Our data, our destiny." Sovereignty had escaped the confines of policy papers. It was alive in songs, murals, and conversations at street corners. International partners watched closely. China, India, and Russia courted Africa with offers of infrastructure and training, pledging to respect local laws. European firms, divided among themselves, weighed compliance against withdrawal. Western governments debated sanctions but hesitated, wary of driving the continent further into the arms of alternative partners. In global forums, African leaders spoke with a new tone, no longer as petitioners, but as negotiators demanding fair terms. The road ahead, however, would require more than rhetoric. Enforcing regulations against powerful corporations would test the strength of institutions. Ensuring transparency within African governments themselves would challenge leaders to match their words with deeds. Above all, sustaining unity across a continent of 54 nations would demand patience, diplomacy, and trust. And yet, despite these challenges, hope glowed like a lamp carried into the night. Operation Clearsight had shown that even a small, landlocked nation could redraw the map of power by defending invisible borders. If Burkina Faso could spark a movement, then what might Nigeria, Kenya, or South Africa achieve if they followed? The harvest of this seed depended on whether Africa would nurture it with persistence. The foundations had been laid, the path illuminated. The question that remained was not whether Africa could rise, but whether it had the endurance to walk the long road toward a sovereignty worthy of its people. From the streets of Ouagadougou to the chambers of the African Union, Operation Clearsight became more than a dawn raid. It became a story of awakening. What began with 17 buildings and 2 million stolen profiles ended with a continent questioning who truly owns its future. For the people of Burkina Faso, the message was unmistakable. Sovereignty is not a relic of the past, but the heartbeat of the present. This moment stitched together the three emotions that define revolutions: anger at the violation of privacy and dignity, regret for the 15 years in which Africa lived under a digital occupation unseen, and above all, hope. Hope that a new chapter is possible, where the continent can write its own code, guard its own resources, and shape its own destiny. The call for an anti-colonial Africa is not nostalgia. It is a renewal, a recognition that exploitation no longer arrives with armies and flags, but with servers and satellites. Independence today must be defended not only on battlefields, but in data centers and algorithms. The challenge is formidable, but the will is clear. Citizens, leaders, and movements have already declared, "Our data, our choice." Across the globe, the debate has already shifted. Western capitals may describe the new doctrine as destabilizing, but African streets call it justice. International corporations may hesitate, but African startups are rising. Each fiber cable laid by African hands, each server housed within African borders, is another step in the long road of African sovereignty. The question for tomorrow is simple yet profound. Will this spark endure? Can Africa resist the pressure of sanctions, the temptation of easy contracts, the inertia of old habits? If one small, landlocked nation can dare to rise, what stops the rest? This is Africa's Monroe Doctrine for the digital age, a doctrine not of isolation, but of dignity. A statement that the continent is no longer a laboratory, no longer a blind spot, but a partner on equal ground. The story of Operation Clearsight closes here, but the movement it inspired is only beginning. To those who believe in an anti-colonial Africa, this is the moment to stand tall. To those who believe in freedom's digital frontier, this is the time to act. If your heart beats for Africa's dignity, do not let this story fade. Subscribe, comment, and share. Let the world hear that Africa bows to no one.